That's the end of the talk. I don't think I should say anything else or I'm going to mess it up. Thank you, Peter. That was very, very nice. So the topic today is dual well, before I give you the name of the topic, let me tell you the reason I chose this topic. We were hoping today that Brian O'Rourke, who is the president of the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, or known as CADTH, would be here and could tell us something about his organization. So we selected this particular talk to fit his discussion. And you'll see how this talk does fit in with CADTH, but just a little bit about CADTH, just 1 minute of worth of CADTH. It's a national agency in Canada. And the national agency is interested in things like drugs and devices, medical devices and so forth, not from a regulatory perspective. So places like Health Canada or the FDA or EMA, they would be interested in the safety and effectiveness of a drug or a medical device, whereas CADTH is interested in a much broader perspective of around those products. More specifically, they're interested in the cost effectiveness of it. So not only does it work well and doesn't hurt you, okay, it also is cost effective. So that's all part of what I'll call health technology assessment approach, in which we're going to be taking particular aspects of health technology assessment to address this particular question. Okay, and so what's the question? And we did this in conjunction with CADTH. In fact, this is the CADTH report on dual antiplatelet therapy following PCI, the clinical and economic impact of standard versus extended duration. Okay, the references, the authors and the citation is here. This is a report that we produced last year and submitted to CADTH. This becomes part of their evidence base on which to move forward in terms of potentially making this drug or recommending this drug be available for this particular indication across the country. You'll notice that the authorship, okay, includes a number of individuals from our group, and there's pictures of 4 of them. The other thing I should mention is that until this morning, when I happened to talk to Dr. Green in the hallway about an hour ago, I didn't know if I had a voice. I lost my voice on Friday. It returned miraculously an hour ago, and I was talking to Dr. Green, and little did they know that one of these people, probably Jessie, who's the first one there, was going to do the presentation for me, but she didn't know that 2 hours ago, or she didn't know that until right now. Anyway, the other person on this list you'll notice is Dr. Derek So. Derek was the clinical expert, okay, on this particular project. So this team is the one who would put together the review of the literature, all the analyses as it relates to the clinical and economic analysis. Dr. So was the clinical expert providing us with insight. The last 2 authors on this list are from CADTH. They're both health economists because, again, remember, CADTH wants to look at more than just safety and efficacy. They want to look at cost effectiveness. Okay, so what do we have? To prepare for this, we did a project where we actually looked at dual antiplatelet therapy in general. We published an umbrella review on this. We also put together in BMJ Open a protocol on how we're going to go about this. And this is this we're going to do. Okay, we're going to be looking at dual antiplatelet therapy. It's going to be a combination of a P2Y12 inhibitor. And we really, does it show up here? Oh, good. We really don't know whether if it involves clopidogrel, prasugrel, or ticagrelor. If it's used in relationship in conjunction with aspirin, we're going to consider it as a DAPT combination, and it's going to be part of our study. And why do we want to study this? Well, routinely following PCI with stenting, the aim of preventing stent thrombosis and other major adverse cardiac and cerebrovascular events, okay, is a concern. The standard practice is to prescribe DAPT for 6 to 12 months, okay, after PCI. The current guidelines recommend tailoring the length of DAPT depending on the individual characteristics. For example, if someone were to present with acute coronary syndrome at the time of PCI, they may be better to go on a longer-term DAPT beyond the 12 months than a short term. So we would like to identify that, and that's the goal of this particular study. So given the risk of stent thrombosis, given the risk of recurrent ischemic events, interest in extending DAP beyond the 12 months is important. It could provide reduction of these, but we have to worry about the opposite side of the coin, which is the bleeding side. Identifying those patients most likely to benefit from the extended DAP is important. So we went to the DAP score, we looked at some of the literature and the reviews, and there were 5 subgroups that we're interested in. We're interested in those who would have a prior MI, is this something important to consider if we go to an extended DAP or not? We're interested in ACS, whether you presented with ACS at the time of PCI, and again, would you go to an extended DAP or not? Diabetes, whether the person had diabetes or not, again, would the extended DAP be used? Age, if you're over a certain age, we're going to take the age cutoff of 75. If above and below 75, would that change your opinion, or should change your opinion on prescribing DAP or not? And then finally, whether the patient was a smoker. Okay, would that determine shorter or longer term DAP? Okay, so to make appropriate decisions, clinicians require transparent, they require a comprehensive review of the evidence to evaluate its benefits and harms, okay, associated with going beyond the 12 months. So it's kind of a personalized therapy, if you wish, and we're looking for the best outcomes for the patients. That's one side. The other side is, given the current uncertainty about the benefits and harms of extended DAP beyond the 12 months, we need to look at that evidence closer from both a clinical and economic impact, because not only are clinicians interested in this, but healthcare decision makers are, policy makers are, and patients are. So it's a much broader question, really, than just the clinical question. So what did this do? This led Cadith to ask, the objective was to evaluate the clinical benefits and harms, okay, as well as the cost effectiveness of extending DAP beyond 12 months, okay, in clinically relevant subgroups. And that's the interest here, is the subgroups of these patients, of the PCI patients, who recently underwent a PCI with stenting. And so we're interested in, for example, clopidogrel plus aspirin for a shorter duration, or a standard duration, if you wish, 6 to 12 months, versus it going a longer duration, above 12 months. And similar if we use prasugrel or ticagrelor. So that is our goal, our objective in this work. Okay, what did Cadith want? They had 2 policy questions. Now remember, Cadith has to worry about value for money, if you wish. So for patients who recently underwent PCI with either a bare metal stent or a drug-eluting stent, the question number 1 was, should these P2Y12 inhibitors be reimbursed beyond the 12-month period? And if that is true, which of the P212 inhibitors, clopidogrel, prasugrel, or ticagrelor, should be funded beyond that? Because remember, one of the goals of Cadith, or one of the remits of Cadith, is that they have to recommend to the provinces who pay for these things whether this should go on their formulary to be paid for this particular indication. Okay. Our interest was to answer, in answering this, was to answer certain research questions. I'm going to give you 4, 2 on this slide and 2 on the next slide. And don't get too confused. They're basically repetitions of each other. So even though it looks like there's 2 slides full of letters, don't worry about it. So what are we going to do here? What is the comparative clinical efficacy and safety, okay, of using a shorter duration DAP, so somewhere between 6 to 12 months after PCI, versus longer duration, okay, something like greater than 12 months, could be 18, 24, whatever, okay, following PCI with either a bare metal or a drug-eluting stent. And we want to look at that in all post-PCI patients. We also want to look into those 5 subgroups, those with a prior MI, those presenting with ACS at the time of PCI, okay, those with diabetes, those maybe in different age groups, and those who smoke. Okay, we're going to repeat this particular objective, okay, by asking a similar question, but now specifically say, what about clopidogrel? What about prasugrel? What about ticagrelor? Can we say something specific about those 3 different P2Y12 inhibitors. So that's the first two research questions. The next research questions are exactly the same, okay, laid out, making the same comparison groups, looking at the same subgroups, okay, looking at now the cost effectiveness, okay, of it. So not just whether it's safe and effective, but whether it's cost effective. So the two objectives are, again, overall for the P2Y12 inhibitors, and specifically, okay, for each of those three P2Y12 inhibitors, clopidogrel, prasugrel, and ticagrelor. Okay. So before we do anything, we define a PICO. Okay, the population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcome of interest. I'll give you the PICO in detail because we're going to be looking at it over and over again from different perspectives in the next few slides. The patient population, adult patients who've undergone PCI with any type of stent, bare metal or drug-eluting, and who are receiving DAP. That's the population, patient population we're interested in. The intervention, okay, it would be DAP following a PCI, okay, with stenting, PCI with stenting for an extended duration, over 12 months, so long-term DAP. DAP may involve any type of these P2Y12 inhibitors, clopidogrel, prasugrel, or ticagrelor, and it would be in combination with ASA. The comparator is exactly the same, okay, except now that DAP is going to be for 6 to 12 months, so it's shorter term, standard DAP, whatever term you wish to use. The outcomes, we're interested in a whole host of outcomes. Our primary ones are going to be death of all causes, cardiovascular death, non-cardiovascular death. We're also interested in a number of secondary outcomes, bleeding, all sorts of major and minor, and so on and so forth, urgent target vessel revascularization, major adverse cardiac and cerebrovascular events, myocardial infarction, stroke, and stent thrombosis. When we look at reviewing all the literature in this review, we're going to be only looking at randomized controlled trials. And in terms of subgroups, again, we're interested in all patients and these 5 particular subgroups I identified earlier for you. So that's the PICO statement. Now, what are the methods? For those who've heard me talk about systematic reviews before, you'll recognize this diagram or this layout. And what I'm going to do now is actually populate it specifically for this review that we conducted. Okay, so the steps. The first step, of course, is to have a nice, clearly formulated question, and we've done that. I just gave you the PICO. I told you the population, told you the intervention, comparative interest. I indicated the outcomes for you and the types of studies. The next thing we did was we ran a comprehensive review of the literature. This was performed by an information specialist that works with us using a peer-reviewed search strategy. We, by the way, do have Sarah Byzantine here as our librarian who could do this for you. I can't do these things. It's very informative to have an information scientist actually do it. We looked at Medline, we looked at Embase, Cochrane Library, PubMed. We used a filter to sort out the RCTs. We didn't include conference abstracts or opinion pieces. We made regular update searches and updates and alerts to make sure that we're up to date before we submitted this to CADIF. We did a gray literature search as well, where in the gray literature it was targeted. In particular, we looked at clinicaltrials.gov. Okay. Unbiased selection and extraction process. We used 2 independent reviewers using eligibility criteria based upon that PICO. They went and they looked at all the titles and abstracts that were found in literature search. Any one that was deemed relevant by one reviewer went on to full text. At the full text level, each reviewer would have to say it's in or out, and they would have to agree, again, using the same eligibility criteria. All of this particular process would be facilitated by Distiller software, where we can hold on to the PDFs and manipulate them the way we wish. And the reasons for rejecting studies, we always record. Now this is going to expand because now the data extraction process, data were extracted by one reviewer using a standardized form, checked for accuracy by a second one. The original publication and any associated publications with it. As you know, when you do a randomized controlled trial, you may have your mainline publication. There could also be a publication on the proposal. It could be a publication on a subgroup of interest or other outcomes of interest. So we gather all that information to extract the data. We extracted the characteristics of the studies. We extracted the key line baseline patient characteristics. We extracted the interventions studied, including the duration, the type of P2Y12 inhibitor. We extracted data related to the outcomes, okay? All the event data that would be related to the outcomes I listed earlier for you. And we would do this overall, and we do it for each of those 5 subgroups. Critical appraisal of the data. We basically use the risk of bias tool out of Cochrane to judge it on whether it's sequence generation, its allocation, its blinding, its incomplete outcome data, and selective reporting were well done. All these could be associated with biases, and the risk of bias tool would tell us. And then our first person would make a judgment on low, high, or unclear risk of bias, and then that would be evaluated by a second reviewer and resolved by disagreement resolved by consensus. The analysis. So all our analyses are going to be event data. So we're going to be interested in only the blue here, so I don't have to talk about the gray. All the blue here. And so we're going to be looking at the risk ratio or relative risk. What is the risk of a particular outcome occurring if you were on extended DAP versus short-term DAP? We would extract the data from the papers. We would then look at its heterogeneity to see as we go from one study to the next, is it saying the same thing? We would use either a fixed or random effects model. I'll tell you which one in a second. We would then display all our information using forest plots, as you'll see. One more thing about the analysis of the data. It was analyzed using RevMan, the Cochrane tool. We used random effects. We calculated relative risks and 95% confidence intervals. If we saw a lot of heterogeneity from one study to the next, as indicated by a statistic called I-squared, if I-squared goes over 75%, we have a problem. We will not put the data together. And you're going to see there's instances, and a very important instance of this in the results. We wanted to look at a Bayesian technique where we could actually compare all 3 of these specific P2Y12 inhibitors, but we could not because the data was not specific enough. In terms of subgroups, these are the 5 subgroups we're interested in, as illustrated earlier. And then we'd also look at sensitivity analysis, for example, bare metal stents versus drug-eluting stents. And then we interpreted it, okay, which is there. Okay. So what are the results? So we went and we found 4,561 titles and abstracts. Getting rid of duplicates, we went down to 3,463. We found an additional 126 relevant articles. That gave us titles, and that gave us 3,589. Most of these would be eliminated, again, based upon those selection criteria from the PICO, and they would be eliminated at the title and abstract stage. But 64 were actually eliminated at the full text. We ended up with 49 records. Those 49 records all related to 13 unique randomized controlled trials. So that provided our evidence base. In our 13 randomized controlled trials, 8 of them contained data that was usable. 4 of them were only in clinicaltrials.gov with no data published. Okay, and 1 was a protocol. Okay, so of the 13, 8 were usable. Of these, just to give you an idea, 6 were single country. Most were open labeled. Many were superior studies. 5 of the studies used drug-eluting stents only. None of the studies used a bare metal stent. 4 of them used, and 3 of them used a combination of the 2. In terms of the inhibitor, 4 of them used clopidogrel only. None were specifically for prasugrel or ticagrelor, and 4 used multiple types of the inhibitors. The studies went from 2012 to 2017. This has been updated to last year, and there hasn't been any new additional studies that satisfy our inclusion criteria. Okay. These are the 8 studies. Nippon, I'm sure some of you have known these, OptiDual, Italic, DAPT, DES Late, Arctic Int, Prodigy, and an unnamed one. I guess he must be a cardiologist. He could have come up with that name. Anyway, the groups, you can see the differences of the short term and the long term as you go along, 6 months, 24 months, and so forth. And if you take a look at these columns, you can see that by far the vast majority, okay, included clopidogrel. Some included prasugrel, in particular the largest one, which was the DAPT trial, appropriately named, and very little, basically none, included ticagrelor. Now, in terms of the risk of bias, this is really a unique situation to find such good results from a design perspective. You can see that most of them had very, very low risk of bias. There was some cases where you can see less. So for example, all of the studies scored perfect and had low risk of bias related to blinding, incomplete data, selective reporting. About 85% of them, okay, had sequence generation and so on. So you can see they were very, very well designed studies. None of them had a high risk of bias. Okay, so this is the layout of the data. What we have is on the left-hand side are some of the things that we're interested in. On the top is our all patient group. In addition to that, we have our 5 subgroups. Or sorry, 5 subgroups we're interested in. All this data was analyzed in great excruciating detail, which I'm not going to give you. I'm only going to go through the X's. I'm going to show you some of the forest plots and so forth that relate to the all group. Okay, and then present you with the summary table, and then after that I'll just present the summary tables to you. Okay, otherwise we'll be here all afternoon, and I'm sure you don't want to listen to me all afternoon. Jesse, I'm losing my voice, so get ready. All right, let's take a look at all patients. Let me orientate you to these graphs first of all. That doesn't show, that does show up that good. So we're looking at the outcome all-cause death. We have a study by Colette. There were 645 individuals here were randomized to extended DAP. 7 of them had the event all-cause death. Next, we have 641 individuals were randomized to the short-term 6 to 12-month DAP. 9 of them had all-cause death. Okay, so when we look at the risk of all-cause death, we get a relative risk of 0.77. The confidence interval goes from 0.29 to 2.06. This is actually illustrated in the diagram to the right. That point there is the relative risk of 0.77, and then we have its lower confidence limit of 0.29, its upper confidence limit of 2.06. And the actual value here is not statistically significant because the confidence interval, as you can see, crosses this line, which is the neutral value 1. Okay. It does lean towards the left, which means it favors the longer extended DAP, and therefore the risk of having all-cause mortality is lower, but not statistically. And then you get the other studies going along. You'll also notice, as we have this for each of the 7 studies, you'll notice that we have a little dot sitting here. The bigger this is, means that the more weight that particular study will get when we sit there and do the meta-analysis and combine all these into the overall estimate. The overall estimate is 1.07, which is the center of that diamond. The 2 tips of the diamond are the lower 0.80 and upper 1.42 confidence limit. And again, since it crosses 1, it's not statistically significant. And that's confirmed down in this corner where we see that the p-value here is 0.65, indicating no significant difference between extended DAP and short-term DAP as relates to all-cause death. You'll notice that the I-squared here is 45%. Okay, we like to see it smaller, but it's certainly less than 75%. So that's an indication of how different these studies are from one another, and we still feel relatively confident we can combine them. We do the same thing for cardiovascular death. We find no difference. We go off to non-cardiovascular death. This is an interesting one. In the largest study, known as DAPT, which involved close to 5,000 individuals, they found an elevated risk, okay, of non-cardiovascular death, okay, when they looked at extended DAP compared to short-term DAP. However, when we looked at two other studies, the Nippon and the OptiDual, which were published, I believe, after DAPT, both of those did not show an increase in non-cardiovascular death. In fact, it went the opposite way, okay? They actually found that, although not statistically significant, non-cardiovascular death was lower, okay? The risk was lower in extended DAP than not. So this is a case where there was a large degree of heterogeneity. This is the case where we would not combine it because the two are so extreme. We'll come back to that. Myocardial infarction. So we now have 6 studies reported on myocardial infarction in all patients, and you can see that there is a highly significant reduction, okay, in MI on extended DAP compared to standard DAP. The relative risk is 0.58, so we see a 42% relative risk reduction, and the confidence interval certainly does not include 1. In fact, the p-value here is an embarrassing bunch of zeros, 1. That's very, very small, and no and no variability. Stroke, we didn't find a difference. Stent thrombosis, not very variable information, very wide confidence interval. It does just barely touch the 1, but it's not significant. Definite or probable stent thrombosis, we do get statistical significance on this. Urgent revascularization, no difference. Again, few studies, wide confidence intervals. And then MACE. MACE came in different forms and formulations. The most common formulation was MACE was a composite of all-cause death, MI or stroke. And we can see that we actually had 5 studies that did that. It's interesting when the large DAP study was sitting on the left-hand side, indicating a significant reduction, okay, in this particular definition of MACE if you were on extended versus short DAPT. But you'll notice that several studies afterwards in 2015 and 14 all were sitting on the right-hand side, okay, not indicating significant increase, but certainly favoring short-term DAP as it relates to MACE. Okay, so, but the bottom line is there's no difference between the two. There was other definitions of MACE that may include major bleeding, and again, you can see the actual relative risk here did not include 1. It was not statistically significant. GI bleeding. Not very much information, not statistically significant. TIMI major, not statistically significant, but leaning towards more of a problem with extended DAP as it relates to bleeding than it would be for standard or short-term DAP. Minor bleeding, no difference. As we all know, there's a number of different definitions and classifications and so forth for bleeding. Here's the full list that we found when we went through the papers, and you can see the results. For BARC type 2, 3, 4 and combinations, 2, 3, 5 and combinations of 2, 3, 5, you'll see that there's no statistical significance. Okay, the confidence intervals all include 1. When we get to gusto definition, you'll notice that for moderate, there is a statistically significant increase in bleeding, okay, as it relates to extended DAP versus standard DAP. We didn't see it for severe, but you did see it in the combinations. And for the other ways of looking at bleeding, again, there was no statistical significance. So, bottom line in summary, when we look at all the patients, okay, not the subgroups, which we're going to go in a second, all the patients, when we compare extended DAP to shorter term, 6 to 12 months, what do we find? We find with extended, there's reduced risk of MI. There's a reduced risk of probable or definite stent thrombosis. We find that there's an increased risk of moderate bleeding, as given by the gusto definition. We find that non-cardiovascular death is a bit of a question mark. One large study, the DAPT trial, reports a significant increased risk of non-cardiovascular death, but no significance was found from these 2 other studies. They were smaller, but they were still in the hundreds, and one was in the thousands, but not as large as the DAPT. Results were similar when we looked at the subset of patients with DES, okay, for drug-eluting stents, because most of them used drug-eluting stents. We couldn't say anything specifically about implanted, when we implant a bare metal stent. Okay, so looking at the summary of all patients, and again, as I said, the DES results are essentially the same as the overall group because very few had bare metal stents. You'll notice that we got an up arrow, a down arrow, and an arrow going across. If it's an up arrow, that indicates that the risk of the event is higher in the DAPT group, the extended DAPT group, than in the standard. The down arrow means there's a reduced risk in that particular group, and the arrow going side to side said there's no statistical significance. Okay, so what did we find when we looked at all patients? We find that the non-cardiovascular death you may be at greater risk in extended DAPT because of the results of the DAPT trial, but there was a reduced risk of MI, there was a reduced risk of probable or definite thrombosis, but there was a corresponding increase in bleeding as given by the Gusto definition of moderate. Okay. And that's the all. Okay, so now I'm not going to give you all of those forest plots anymore. I'm just going to give you the summary as it relates to our 5 groups. Okay, and let's see what happens. Let's go to the prior MI. So just to orientate you to the graph here, we're looking again at extended versus short-term DAPT. We'll look at those who had a prior MI, and we'll then look at the patient population that had no prior myocardial infarction. Okay, so for those who had a prior MI, what did we find? We found a decrease in MI. We found a decrease in probable or definite thrombosis, and a decrease in MACE if you use the extended DAPT. We found the corresponding, though, an increase in bleeding, as again is given by the Gusto moderate, as well as given by BARC. When we go to the no PI group, so the patient subgroup that did not have a previous MI, there was actually an increase in all-cause death, but again, a corresponding decrease in MI, a decrease in stent thrombosis, with a corresponding increase in bleeding, whether it be the Gusto definition or the BARC definition. So that's what happens in the subgroup of people with prior MI. What about the people who patients who present with ACS at the time of PCI? What happened? We have, for those, again, you'll notice that all our studies only looked at the ACS population, presented with ACS at time of PCI. So we had no information there. But for the subgroup of patients with the ACS, we found a decrease in MI if you're on extended DAPT, a decrease in probable or definite stent thrombosis, and again, a corresponding increase in bleeding either by the Gusto or the BARC definition. It's starting to get a little bit routine here. So let's try another one. Let's try diabetes. So we have a group of patients with diabetes and a group without diabetes. Let's go with diabetes. So we have a diabetic patient. We think about extended DAPT. According to this data, there is no benefit. Okay, I do not see any decrease in MI, any decrease in stroke with extended DAPT. I do, though, see a bleeding problem, okay, as given by the BARC definitions. Okay, so there's no gain here, but potentially a loss in the sense of the bleed for people with diabetes. With no diabetes, we see a decrease with extended DAPT. We see a reduced risk of MI, a reduced risk of probable or definite stent thrombosis, a reduced MACE, and an increase, again, bleeding as related to the Gusto definition. Age. Okay, age, fortunately, is over 75 years of age, so for those who are still under 75, we're all young. In terms of age, again, if you take a look at those over the age of 75, with extended DAPT, you're going to get an increase of stroke. You're going to get an increase of bleeding as given by the Gusto definition and the BARC 235 bleeding definition. So there's a losing situation here. Okay, you potentially have a harm and you have a harmful non-benefit. Okay, in terms of less than 75 years of age, you do see a decrease. You'll see a reduction in MI, a reduction in probable or definite stent thrombosis, and a reduction in MACE. You'll notice all of these have a little asterisk associated with it. And the reason for that is that you saw this reduction in the very large DAP trial from 2014, but it was not replicated in one or two of the other trials, okay, that came after that particular one. So we have some inconsistency there, so we put the little asterisk on it. But there's no asterisk on the fact that the bleeding is up either by the gusto or the BARC definition. And finally, the last group, smoking. If you smoke, patient smokes, and you put them on extended DAP, you'll see a reduced risk of MI, a reduced risk of probable or definite thrombosis, a reduced risk of MACE, and nothing with respect to bleeding in terms of increased risk. On the no smoking side, okay, you'll see, again, a decrease in MI, a decrease in risk of stent thrombosis associated with extended DAP, but an increase in the moderate bleeding in the BARC definition of bleeding. Okay. So let me provide you with a summary of this whole thing. Prior MI. Okay, among those with prior MI, you're going to get a reduced risk of MI, a probable or definite reduction for stent thrombosis and MACE, but an increase of moderate bleeding. Among those without a prior MI, you'll see again a reduction in MI, stent thrombosis, but an increase in all-cause death and an increase in moderate bleeding. If you take a look at individuals who have acute coronary syndrome at the time of presenting for PCI, among those with ACS, there is a reduction in the risk of MI and probable or definite stent thrombosis, but an increased risk of bleeding. And we cannot say anything about the group that does not present with ACS because the data was too limited. For those with diabetes, among those with diabetes, patients with diabetes, an increased risk of bleeding, very little benefit. Among those without diabetes, you do get a benefit. You get a risk of reduced risk of MI, a reduced risk of probable or definite stent thrombosis and MACE when you put them on extended DAP, but an increased risk of bleeding. For age, for those over the age of 75, there's an increased risk of stroke and bleeding, not very helpful. Among those less than 75, we found a reduced risk of MI, probable or definite stent thrombosis. Again, in brackets, you can see I put, although the evidence is inconsistent, okay, again, because of the difference between the DAP trial and other trials, but there's also an increased risk of bleeding. And finally, among smokers, reduced risk of MI, definite or probable stent thrombosis and MACE with extended DAP. Among the non-smokers, okay, you'll see again a reduced risk of MI, definite or probable stent thrombosis, but now that's associated with an increased risk of bleeding. Now, just very briefly, we have the P2Y12 inhibitor-specific results. Okay, so we're now not looking at any P2Y12 inhibitor combined with aspirin in an extended versus a shorter-term mode. We're just looking at specific ones. Okay, and so if we want to compare clopidogrel with aspirin, okay, over the standard or shorter term, and how does that compare with clopidogrel and aspirin over the longer or extended term? The first thing we can say is that the majority of our studies, okay, 90 to 100% of the patients in all these various studies were actually administered clopidogrel. So no further analysis was done on this because essentially the analysis I just showed you, okay, was the analysis that would also hold for clopidogrel. Okay, what about the other two P2Y12 inhibitors? Okay, for prasugrel, so we got prasugrel, aspirin, short term, prasugrel, aspirin, extended. 4 RCTs actually used prasugrel. It only included somewhere between 0.1% to 35% of the study participants. The one that included the 35% was a DAP trial. In fact, it had a subgroup of participants who received prasugrel, over 3,000. All right. Yeah, in total. It was a 10,000 patient study. So in the DAP trial, participants received prasugrel for at least 12 months, which is the half of them that got randomized to the half of the 3,456 that got randomized to the extended. This is what was found: reduced risk of MI, reduced risk of definite probable stent thrombosis, and reduced risk of MACE, very similar to before. Increased risk of bleeding as given by the Gusto moderate definition. No data available for death or stroke, urgent revascularization, or TIMI bleeding. Okay. And then finally for ticagrelor, insufficient evidence all around. Only one eligible trial, okay, the Antiplatelet trial, actually had these types of patients in it, but it was only 0.1% of the participants in the short term received it, and nobody received it in the longer term. So we couldn't say anything about ticagrelor. There is one large study. We were asked about why we didn't include it, which is the Pegasus TIMI 54. It involved ticagrelor. It was identified, but it did not satisfy any of our inclusion criteria. Did not satisfy several of our inclusion criteria. For example, not everybody had a PCI before randomization, for example. So, what's the bottom line? Okay, my last slide. Extended DAPT after PCI was mostly beneficial in reducing MI and probable or definite stent thrombosis, but at the potential cost of increased bleeding risk. Second point, most data available was for clopidogrel. So one could say this is a clopidogrel-based DAPT review. Okay, the two sub-bullets, prasugrel-based DAPT, there was limited data, but had similar results to the clopidogrel-based results. Ticagrelor-based DAPT, lack of data. And again, it's too bad we could not include the Pegasus trial. For extended clopidogrel-based DAPT, there's an increased risk of death among those without prior MI, okay, if they got the extended DAPT. And there was an increased risk of stroke among those who are older, over the age of 75 years. What about the general group? So in general, okay, patients who had a prior MI or patients who presented to PCI with ACS or patients who are not diabetic, I should say a patient who does not have diabetes, or a younger patient under the age of 75 years. In this case, they may derive most benefit from extended DAPT, provided that the increased risk of bleeding is accounted for when deciding to extend DAPT beyond 12 months. So that's the bottom line, the clinical result. I could show you some of the economics. What you'll find is that in general, the extended DAPT, I'll show you one diagram just to illustrate it, but ignore it, the details. So when we have, for example, for all patients, and when they looked at the analysis, they did what was called a two-stage Markov model. They used data from this clinical review. They used data from other sources to look at long-term impact. So it's a real tenuous situation in terms of the assumptions made, as many economic evaluations unfortunately have to be. But you'll see that in general, the costs associated with short-term is more costly than extended. The QALYs, okay, indicating outcome on which utilities are based, are less, okay, than for the extended. And so what this means is since the cost for extended DAP is less, the QALYs are better, it's dominant. The extended is dominant over the shorter term. Also, when we look at prior ACS, no diabetes, all three of these, okay, from a cost perspective are dominant, cost effectiveness perspective are dominant, okay? They cost less for extended DAP and better QALYs leading to better utilities. And then finally, you'll notice there's one here, which is when you're over 75 years of age, then not only is extended DAP more expensive, it's got less benefit, okay, and there in this particular case, shorter is dominant over the extended, okay. And I think I'll end there. I just want to say that the economic findings are in sync with the clinical findings. I think it calls for a careful selection of your patients on who's going to benefit the most from extended DAP versus standard DAP. And I think this is this particular analysis right now, the paper is out for publication. It's been submitted. As I said, it's been updated. I think we have to keep a very, very close eye on the other RCTs that are coming out so that we can get more robust data into some of these subgroups to be able to make this recommendation at the end that much better. And that's it. Okay, that's it, Peter. I'm finished. Thank you. I want to leave some time.